December 4, 1941, Moscow Military Communications Center. The telegraph operator's hands trembled as he transcribed the message from Soviet procurement officers in London. Not from cold, though the building's heating had failed hours ago. From disbelief. The request was specific, urgent, almost desperate. 3,000 Valentine infantry tanks, immediate delivery, Arctic convoy priority despite U-boat wolves circling every route north. British generals considered the Valentine outdated, a compromise design with a cramped turret and modest gun. Yet here were Soviet officers demanding thousands of them by name, willing to risk merchant sailors' lives in the frozen North Atlantic to get them. The operator stamped the message urgent and passed it forward, unaware he'd just witnessed history's largest single Allied tank order. Before we continue the story of an unlikely hero, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories of World War II, the moments that changed history but rarely make the textbooks. Share in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Your support helps us continue uncovering these remarkable stories of courage, ingenuity, and survival. Outside, Moscow's winter was tightening its grip. Temperatures had already dropped to -25°C, and meteorologists predicted worse to come. In tank depots across the frozen approaches to the capital, Soviet crews were learning a brutal lesson about mechanical warfare in extreme cold. Their T-26 light tanks sat silent. Petrol engines seized solid despite fires burning beneath the hulls since dawn. KV-1 heavy tanks, magnificent in specifications and terrifying in appearance, had become metal monuments to engineering complexity. A single broken track link required specialized tools and factory equipment no field unit possessed. The Germans were 60 kilometers from the Kremlin, and half of Soviet armor couldn't start. The Valentine request wasn't born from ignorance. Soviet military observers stationed in Britain throughout 1940 and 1941 had done something their German counterparts never bothered with. They'd watched British tank regiments train through winter. They'd interviewed crews returning from North Africa's heat and Scotland's ice. They'd noticed something the British War Office itself seemed to overlook. While heavier tanks spent days in repair depots, Valentine crews simply kept driving. The formal specifications showed an unremarkable vehicle, modest armor, a 2-pounder gun already considered inadequate, a cramped 2-man turret that British crews openly mocked. But buried in the maintenance logs was a different story. The Valentine worked. In rain, in mud, in cold, in heat, it worked. And in December 1941, with German panzers freezing in the snow outside Moscow, reliability mattered more than any specification sheet. Then came the detail that changed everything. Soviet engineers studying the Valentine's technical manual discovered its power plant could be completely removed and serviced by 3 men with basic tools in under 2 hours. No cranes, no specialized equipment, no factory technicians, just soldiers with spanners working in a frozen field. They realized British engineers had accidentally built exactly what Soviet forces desperately needed, a tank simple enough that freezing, exhausted crews could keep it running when everything else had failed. The Valentine story began 3 years earlier, on a date that gave the tank its unlikely name. February 14th, 1938. Vickers Armstrong submitted their proposal to the British War Office on Valentine's Day, a quirk of bureaucratic timing that would attach romantic nomenclature to one of history's most utilitarian combat vehicles. The design team, led by engineers who'd spent the 1930s watching Europe rearm with growing dread, had proposed something deliberately conservative. An infantry support tank built around proven components and straightforward engineering. Nothing cutting edge, nothing experimental. Just solid, manufacturable, reliable. The War Office examined the blueprints with polite disinterest. Britain already had the Matilda II entering production, heavily armored and seemingly far more suitable for modern warfare. The Valentine looked ordinary, even boring. Its 2-pounder gun was adequate but unimpressive. Its armor was moderate. Its design philosophy emphasized simplicity over sophistication. The proposal was filed away, gathering dust while Europe slid toward war. Nobody imagined that within 3 years, this rejected design would become the most produced British tank of the entire conflict. or that over 40% of production would sail to Soviet ports through submarine-infested Arctic waters. Vickers's engineering philosophy came directly from lessons learned building tanks since the Great War. British military doctrine in the late 1930s divided armored vehicles into two categories: heavily armored infantry tanks that crawled forward with foot soldiers and faster cruiser tanks that exploited breakthroughs. The Valentine was meant to be an infantry tank, but Vickers engineers had quietly bent the rules. They used the chassis and suspension from the earlier A-10 cruiser tank, giving the Valentine a respectable 24 kilometers per hour top speed. More importantly, they designed every component to be manufacturable by Britain's commercial vehicle industry. No exotic materials, no specialized tooling, just proven engineering that any competent factory could produce. September 1939 shattered peacetime complacency. War erupted, and France became Britain's continental shield. That shield needed tanks immediately. The Matilda II was superb but painfully slow to manufacture. Each hull required specialized casting, and Britain's heavy industrial capacity was limited. By July 1940, with France collapsing and invasion threatening Britain itself, the War Office suddenly remembered that boring Valentine design gathering dust. Vickers received production approval not because generals had reconsidered the tank's merits, but because Britain desperately needed any tank it could build quickly. The Valentine's unglamorous origins became its greatest asset. Assembly lines across Birmingham, Newcastle, and Montreal began producing Valentines using manufacturing techniques borrowed from bus and lorry factories. The hull used simple riveted construction, no complex castings required. The turret was small and cramped for its two-man crew, but easy to produce. The running gear employed leaf springs and road wheels that British industry could manufacture without retooling entire factories. By mid-1941, Britain was producing Valentines faster than any other tank model. When Soviet telegrams started arriving that December, requesting thousands of these supposedly obsolete vehicles, British industrial capacity was already humming. Lieutenant James Crawford, commanding a Valentine in the 8th Royal Tank Regiment, recorded his impressions in a letter home that captured British crews' mixed feelings. "The turret is dreadfully cramped," he wrote. "The commander must operate the radio, direct the driver, observe the battlefield and command the gunner, all whilst crouching in a space barely large enough for a telephone booth. We joke that the Valentine was built for men who enjoy working shoulder to shoulder with their crewmates, and even then it's uncomfortable." Yet Crawford's next paragraph revealed grudging admiration. "But the bloody thing never leaves us stranded. It starts reliably, keeps running, and when something does break, we can often repair it ourselves without waiting for the recovery vehicles. Perhaps that's worth more than comfort." The first Valentines destined for Soviet service were loaded onto merchant ships at Liverpool and Glasgow in October 1941, just as the Arctic convoy system was establishing its deadly routine. Each tank was coated in protective grease, sealed against salt spray, and chained to cargo decks where they would spend 2 weeks exposed to the North Atlantic's fury. The convoy route to Murmansk represented the most direct path for Allied aid to reach Soviet forces, but direct didn't mean safe. Convoys departed from Iceland or Scotland, sailed north around Norway's coast, and entered waters where winter darkness lasted 20 hours each day. German U-boats operated from Norwegian fjords. Luftwaffe bombers flew from captured airfields. Surface raiders lurked in the Arctic mist. Merchant crews knew that if their ship was torpedoed in these waters, survival time in the freezing sea measured in minutes, not hours. Yet the convoys kept sailing because Stalin needed equipment, and he needed it delivered to ports his forces still controlled. The numbers began modestly but accelerated through 1942. January saw 87 Valentines delivered. February brought 112. By March 1942, Soviet crews were receiving over 200 Valentines monthly, and the 3,000 tank order was progressing ahead of schedule despite German interference. Convoy PQ-13 fought a running battle with destroyers and U-boats in late March, losing 5 merchantmen but delivering its cargo of Valentines to Murmansk. Convoy PQ-17, sailing in July 1942, suffered catastrophic losses when the Admiralty ordered the convoy to scatter after false reports of the battleship Tirpitz approaching. 24 merchant ships were sunk, carrying substantial Valentine shipments to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. Each Valentine that reached a Soviet tank regiment represented not just British manufacturing but collective sacrifice. Merchant sailors on Arctic convoys faced mortality rates comparable to frontline infantry. British and Commonwealth naval crews escorting the convoys fought constant battles against U-boats and aircraft. Soviet dock workers unloading ships in Murmansk worked through German bombing raids that targeted the port facilities. By the end of 1942, over 2,000 Valentines had successfully reached Soviet forces. The tanks were already proving their worth in conditions that would have seemed unimaginable to Vickers engineers designing vehicles in peaceful Birmingham. January 12, 1942, 70 kilometers west of Moscow. Temperature, -38°C. Senior Sergeant Dmitry Pavlovich Kuznetsov climbed from his Valentine's turret into air so cold it burned his lungs with each breath. Around him, the tank park looked like a graveyard of frozen metal. Soviet T-34s sat silent despite fires that had burned beneath their hulls since before dawn. The diesel engines, theoretically superior in cold weather, refused to turn over. Lubricants had thickened into something resembling tar. Batteries, drained from hours of attempted starts, could barely turn the cold engines. German panzers a few kilometers west faced identical problems. Their carefully engineered Maybach engines, which had conquered Poland and France with mechanical precision, were never designed for this. Panzer III and I-4 crews faced a morning ritual that began hours before dawn, lighting fires beneath their tanks' hulls, carefully warming the oil pan and transmission housing without cracking the metal through thermal shock. The process took 3 hours if everything went perfectly. Then they attempted to start engines that ran roughly until warmed, through transmissions that ground gears because lubricant couldn't flow properly. Kuznetsov approached his Valentine with skepticism born from bitter experience. The British tank looked small compared to Soviet designs. Its petrol engine seemed like a liability. Surely it would suffer the same cold weather failures as everything else. His crew had received the Valentine 3 weeks earlier, and initial impressions hadn't been favorable. Cramped turret, modest gun, strange controls. But orders were orders, and the battalion commander had been specific. Maintain this equipment. We're attacking at dawn whether the other tanks start or not. What happened next changed Kuznetsov's understanding of mechanical warfare. He drained the engine oil, warmed it by a small fire for 20 minutes, and poured it back through the filler cap. 30 minutes total. His driver hit the starter. The AEC engine coughed once, twice, then caught and ran smoothly. Around them, other tanks remained silent. German panzers weren't even trying to start yet. Soviet T-34s were still being warmed. But 3 British Valentines in Kuznetsov's company were running, their crews performing final checks before the attack. The sergeant climbed back into his turret and keyed the radio. "This is Steel 3. Engine operational. Ready to move." The Valentine's cold weather performance wasn't the result of advanced technology or brilliant innovation. It emerged from engineering decisions so conservative they bordered on boring. Vickers designers in 1938 had made choices that prioritized maintenance simplicity over performance maximization. Those unglamorous decisions became life-saving advantages 4 years later on the frozen Eastern Front. The mechanical genius lay not in what the Valentine could do, but in how reliably it did those modest tasks. Consider the lubrication system, a component most tank designers treated as an afterthought. The Valentine used splash lubrication for major engine components. Essentially, the crankshaft had scoops that flung oil upward as it rotated, bathing the cylinder walls and valve train in lubricant. This was centuries-old technology, the same principle used in farm tractors and commercial lorries. More sophisticated tanks employed pressure lubrication systems with pumps that forced oil through precisely machined galleries to every bearing surface. Pressure systems were theoretically superior, providing more consistent lubrication and better cooling. They also had more failure points. Pumps could seize, galleries could clog, seals could leak, and when they failed, engine damage followed within minutes. The Valentine's splash system was crude, but nearly indestructible. As long as oil remained in the sump and the engine turned, lubrication occurred. Soviet mechanics accustomed to T-34s where engine removal required workshop cranes treated their Valentines with something approaching affection. When a fuel line froze, or a carburetor needed cleaning, Valentine crews fixed the problem in the field while other tank crews were still requisitioning transport to the repair depot. Engine accessibility separated competent designs from excellent ones, and the Valentine excelled through sheer practicality. The power plant sat in the rear hull beneath armored deck plates that could be unbolted by a crew using standard spanners. No specialized tools required, no factory equipment needed. 3 men could remove the entire engine in under 4 hours if necessary. But more importantly, they could access individual components, fuel pumps, carburetors, ignition systems, in minutes. The AEC engine in most British Valentines was a modified version of the power plant used in London buses. The transmission gearbox shared parts with commercial trucks. Road wheels and suspension springs came from existing supply chains. When a Valentine threw a track or broke a spring, replacement parts were available because British industry manufactured similar components by the thousands for civilian vehicles. Soviet factories began stockpiling Valentine spare parts, not because they were exotic, but because they were so standardized that manufacturing them locally became straightforward. Combat reports from the Moscow counteroffensive in January and February 1942 included scattered references to British tanks maintaining operational status, while German and Soviet vehicles failed. A Guards tank regiment operating near Klin reported that 7 of their 9 Valentines remained operational after a week of temperatures below -35°C, while attached T-34s suffered a 50% mechanical failure rate. The Valentine's guns continued firing reliably because the 2-pounder's relatively simple recoil system used springs rather than complex hydraulic mechanisms. When German tanks finally managed to start and engage, their crews found themselves facing British-built vehicles that had been running smoothly since dawn. Lieutenant Dmitry Loza, commanding a tank company in the 3rd Guards Tank Army, filed a report in February 1943 comparing his experiences with Valentines and the American M4 Shermans that were arriving in increasing numbers. His assessment was blunt. The Sherman is a fine machine in summer or autumn. It has speed, a powerful gun, and comfortable crew stations. But in winter, below -30°C, I would choose the Valentine every time. The Sherman requires extensive cold weather preparation that leaves us vulnerable. The Valentine starts. Loza's report noted that his company's 3 Valentines maintained an 85% operational readiness rate during January 1943, while the 4 Shermans attached to his unit achieved only 40% readiness on the coldest days. The Valentine's cramped interior, so derided by British crews, earned different assessments from Soviet tankers accustomed to even worse conditions. Soviet reports described the tight crew compartment as actually beneficial in extreme cold. Body heat from 2 men warmed the fighting space more effectively than in larger turrets. The commander-gunner arrangement, awkward in rapid combat, mattered less in winter warfare where engagements developed slowly and visibility was often limited. Crews learned to appreciate that the small turret presented a lower profile and was harder to spot in snow-covered terrain. At engagement ranges rarely exceeding 500 meters due to snow, fog, and blowing ice crystals, the Valentine's modest gun remained effective against German Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs. Senior Sergeant Nikolai Yakovlevich Jeleznov, a Valentine commander in the Stalingrad sector, reported engaging German positions at -42°C in January 1943. "Our gun fired on the first trigger pull," he wrote. "The German tank we engaged did not fire at all. We learned later his gun's recoil mechanism had frozen. My crew was alive because our simple British gun worked." The Valentine's reliability enabled Soviet crews to develop tactics impossible for units equipped with less dependable vehicles. They moved at night or in bad weather when German tanks were least likely to be operational, arriving at attack positions before dawn when enemy vehicles were still being warmed. Multiple reports described Valentines catching German armor immobilized by cold, unable to respond to sudden attacks. By December 1942, Soviet forces had received 2,300 Valentines. The 3,000th Valentine arrived in April 1943, fulfilling the original order 17 months after the initial request. But deliveries didn't stop there. Britain continued shipping Valentines through 1943 and into early 1944. The final count reached 3,782 Valentines delivered to Soviet forces, making this the largest single tank type supplied through Lend-Lease from Britain. These weren't just numbers on procurement spreadsheets. Each number represented a crew that could fight when everything else had frozen solid. Distribution prioritized Guards tank units and formations operating in the northern and central sectors, where winter conditions were most severe. The 1st Guards Tank Brigade received its first Valentine company in December 1941 and eventually operated an entire battalion of British tanks. The 50th Tank Brigade defending Moscow received Valentines in January 1942 and used them throughout the winter counteroffensive. By mid-1943, over 40 Soviet tank brigades and regiments operated Valentines as either their primary equipment or as significant portions of mixed formations. These units maintained operational readiness rates that units equipped with supposedly superior tanks couldn't match. Stalingrad provided the clearest demonstration of the Valentine's impact. During the desperate winter defense of 1942-43, Soviet forces encircling the German Sixth Army included multiple tank brigades equipped partially or entirely with Valentines. The 24th Tank Corps fighting in the northern sector of the encirclement reported that their Valentine companies maintained combat effectiveness throughout December and January, while temperatures hovered around -35°C. German attempts to break through the encirclement foundered partly because panzers that had conquered half of Europe couldn't reliably start on frozen mornings, while British-built Valentines kept moving. The Valentine's 2-pounder gun was inadequate against heavy German armor, but perfectly sufficient for destroying supply trucks, half-tracks, and light vehicles. Exactly the targets most common during an encirclement battle. The Kursk salient in summer 1943 saw Valentines in a different role. By this point, Soviet factories were producing T-34s in vast numbers, and the Valentine's combat inferiority to modern Soviet designs was undeniable. Yet Valentines remained in frontline service because Soviet logistics could support them easily. The spare parts supply chains established during 1942 continued functioning smoothly. Crews trained on Valentines didn't require retraining. Maintenance procedures were established and familiar. When the German offensive began on July 5, 1943, several Soviet tank brigades defending the northern shoulder of the salient included Valentine companies. They weren't expected to stop Tiger tanks or Panthers in direct combat. Soviet anti-tank guns and dug-in T-34s handled that mission. Valentines performed economy of force operations, covered flanks, supported infantry attacks against positions the Germans had weakened to concentrate their armor elsewhere. Unglamorous work, but essential to the defensive victory that broke German offensive capability in the East. Soviet procurement decisions were never sentimental. Officers evaluating tank performance tracked operational readiness rates, maintenance hours required per running hour, crew casualty rates, and mission completion statistics. Valentines consistently outperformed other Allied tanks in operational readiness, particularly during winter months when readiness mattered most. A typical Soviet tank brigade equipped with Valentines maintained 70 to 80% operational availability during winter operations. Comparable units with Shermans or Matildas struggled to maintain 50% availability under similar conditions. The repeat orders spoke volumes. After the initial 3,000 Valentine request in 1941, Soviet procurement officers requested continued deliveries through 1943. Even as superior tanks became available, they kept ordering Valentines. Not because nothing better existed, but because reliability mattered more than specifications. Sergeant Ivan Pavlovich Goncharov, whose Valentine served through the Kursk battles in summer 1943, summarized the crew perspective in his post-war memoir. "British engineers built us a tank that refused to quit. It was not glamorous, it was not powerful, but every morning it started. In war, that simple fact meant everything. Specifications win arguments in design bureaus. Reliability wins battles in frozen fields." The final Valentines remained in Soviet service into 1944, long after their obsolescence was complete. Some units kept them operational because replacement with T-34s required retraining and reorganization that commanders were reluctant to undertake while engaged in continuous offensive operations. Other units retained Valentines for specialized roles: command vehicles with radios, recovery vehicles for towing damaged tanks, reconnaissance in secondary sectors. A few Valentines even fought in the final 1945 campaigns, relics from a desperate time kept running through mechanical affection and institutional inertia. 3,782 Valentines reached Soviet forces between 1941 and 1944. Hundreds were destroyed in combat. Many were lost to mechanical wear. Some simply disappeared into the chaos of mobile warfare. But during the critical winters when the Eastern Front's outcome hung in balance, those British tanks kept starting, kept moving, kept fighting. The Valentine proved that reliability is a weapon system unto itself, that sophisticated engineering can be inferior to simple robustness, that the tank which keeps running wins battles even if its gun is modest and its armor thin. Soviet tank designers absorbed these lessons. Post-war Soviet armor emphasized maintainability in cold weather operation even while pursuing advanced capabilities. The T-54 and its descendants inherited something of the Valentine's mechanical philosophy: build systems that soldiers can fix, avoid complexity that requires factory equipment, prioritize starting reliability over maximum performance. The reliable underdog had taught the Red Army a lesson worth more than any specification sheet could measure. The British engineers who designed the Valentine in peaceful Birmingham never imagined their conservative, unglamorous creation would become legendary on the frozen steppes of Russia. They'd simply built a tank that prioritized practicality over sophistication, maintenance over performance, reliability over theoretical capability. In doing so, they'd accidentally created exactly what desperate Soviet crews needed most: a machine that refused to quit when everything else had frozen solid. History remembers the dramatic battles, the decisive offensives, the technological breakthroughs. But wars are also won by vehicles that start on cold mornings, by systems that soldiers can repair, by equipment reliable enough that crews trust it with their lives. The Valentine was never the best tank of World War II. It was simply the tank that worked when nothing else would, and in the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, that made all the difference.